And then I'm going to introduce our last speaker for this morning's portion of the program. And that is Phoebe Suina, who is from High Watermark LLC. She'll be joining us via Zoom. And so I think, Jeremy, you're able to pull her up here in a minute. Ms. Suina has a background in environmental engineering and management. She's managed multi-million-dollar emergency and disaster assistance projects for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, in addition to her previous career at the U.S. Department of Energy and Los Alamos National Laboratory. So she'll be joining us today to talk about prior and paramount water rights in New Mexico.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? I don't know if somebody can respond. Yes. So I can make sure. Okay. And then if you could also just respond if my slides are coming up okay?
You're good.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. And I apologize that I can't be there in person today. I had Easter activities here in the Pueblo area. And so it sounds like some lively discussion and a lot of information and different points of view and perspective regarding our blessed Rio Grande River and all of the considerations and concerns, as well as the current legal frameworks and current compacts and agreements associated with our river that runs from Colorado through the heart of New Mexico and on down to Texas, and then eventually to the oceans. I just want to say, if I can just briefly introduce myself in my native language, just to acknowledge everybody and what I bring here today, and some of the perspectives and words that I am carrying today. So if you just kindly just give me a minute here. Cochinaxik Zinhanusutageshpia Tinese. Sona makukitime sona makachme turihin sik hatiti man hin sik kwa neishati go matsani maya ni go ashami anasasi hopa. Goati hopa. Good morning again. I just wanted to acknowledge everybody in my native language. I am from two pueblos here along the Middle Rio Grande, from the Pueblo of Cochiti, where I'm sitting here today, as well as San Felipe Pueblo, which is further down south of where I am today. And I think for my talk, and I again apologize I wasn't able to listen in. I saw some of the agenda and topics, and it's hard for me to via Zoom to have some feedback here and seeing how everybody's responding, but I hope I can bring some good insight and maybe a little bit different perspective of our like I said, our blessed Rio Grande River. And I'll just get into it. And I just want to ground us in in how our Pueblo people have lived here along the Middle Rio Grande since we use a phrase called time immemorial. And in our ways, it goes way back in our oral tradition that is carried generation through generation. And one time somebody asked me and said, well, how long is that? How long really is that? You say you've been here since time immemorial. Well, back in the 60s, in preparation for the building of the Cochiti Lake and the dam, they were excavating and they found Pueblo, I guess you would call them artifacts that were buried there, and they were dated for over 4,000 years ago. So needless to say, we've been here a really long time. We've had to sustain droughts, sustain weather changes, sustain social dynamic changes, we're on our third government here. Our first government that came into the area was the Spanish government, then the Mexican government, then the United States government, where we sit today. So with that background, just to share with you, maybe ground a little bit of where what I've learned over my career, both as in my profession, but as well as my education from the elders and the lessons and stories. And stories isn't really strong enough, but the teachings that have been provided to those living today through our language. So we're one of here in New Mexico in the United States, the 19 Pueblos were federally recognized Indian tribes, again, organized pursuant to the authority of Section 16 of the Act of Congress on June 18, 1934. And then there's been some subsequent amendments to that. And just again to give you some background, here's a quick map that was developed back in the day, and just to show where we are. And you can see our main heart here from Colorado all the way down in the heart is the Middle Rio Grande and the Rio Grande region. And the Middle Rio Grande region, as it's referred to, from Cochiti Lake down south, associated with the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District as well, toward Elephant Butte, as I heard mentioned many times today. That's the area we call the Middle Rio Grande. And what sits upon that Middle Rio Grande is a number of historical pueblos. Again, that's been here since time immemorial. And we have inhabited this area sustainably, ecologically, being part of our watersheds, part of management of the river, and being able to balance our existence and our use of the river over thousands of years. And so as we come into this area, we also look at the coming of the Spanish, and then the development of the Mexican government, and then the establishment of cities and towns here in New Mexico. And so again, just rooting, it's very hard for me also to explain to Pueblo leadership and traditional and secular leadership how we our Pueblo perspective fits in the conversation regarding the stewardship and the taking care of the river. And so it's something I think is so hard because we've evolved in terms of our contact, and I'm going to go through that a little bit of that background. So as I shared, the Spanish came into the area, and our people were living here along the Middle Rio Grande. And there was discussion about migration and coming in. And as I said earlier, there was evidence here at Cochiti that we've been here, Pueblo people have been here over 4,000 years ago. And the way I like to, I guess, frame that as well is just as we've migrated and back and forth, even within the jurisdictional boundaries of Cochiti Pueblo, over hundreds of years, there's times when we were in the mountains because ecologically and environmentally, that's where it was best to have our villages. And then over time, we would go down to the floodplains along the rivers and streams, and then we'd have a village there. And then over time, for whatever reason, maybe flooding or maybe changes in our environment, or even as we experienced during the Spanish contacts, where we had to then migrate back up into the mesa tops. So there was, over the years, how it's been explained to me from elders, is this ebb and flow throughout this region that we now call the Southwest, which includes New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah. So we see that evidence. Archaeologists have now confirmed a lot of footprints along this particular landscape. But in particular, the Rio Grande River, it's been the heart blood, and actually that's how many of our pueblos were developed and were existing when Spanish contact came here. And like I said, we had a real balancing act that we used, where we depended upon the flow of the river, we used the river, but it also depended upon us as well. As now has been documented historically, before Spanish contact, the Pueblo people had elaborate irrigation systems. We also had elaborate farm fields that didn't have irrigation systems, because for periods of time we just relied solely on, along some pueblos and some streams and some arroyos and watersheds, where we relied solely on the rain to water our crops. And Pueblo people, we are a farming, agricultural people. So we really know water, right? And those farmers and ranchers, if there's farmers and ranchers in the room, if you're a longtime farmer or rancher, you are really in tune to how the rivers flow, when rain comes, when snow comes, what is the moisture in your soil. All of that is really embedded in how you live as a farmer, as a rancher. And I would say the same thing is for our Pueblo people. We have ceremonies throughout the year that denote certain times and are related to parts of the hydrological cycle, whether we're talking rain, snow, surface flow, groundwater flow, that really are very complex and elaborate in terms of our understanding of that interdependency of a hydrological cycle. So we had all that understanding before the Spanish came, and when the Spanish came, they saw that we had, the Pueblo people in particular, had villages, had agriculture, had a form of governance. We had already a governance structure here in many of our Pueblo communities. And so as the Spanish were here in 1680, was a really milestone in the area where the Pueblo people actually rose up in an alliance. It's called the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, and there was a coordination uprising amongst many of our pueblos because of the imposition of the Spanish had within our communities, as well as the trying to impose institutional religion like Catholicism. And so there was a little bit of a pushback. And how it's told to me and how I've continued to learn, and every day, my grandpa always taught me, every day you're going to learn. You're going to learn a little bit every day, even if you're in your 90s, you're still going to be learning. That the Pueblo people, although we pushed back the Spanish, and then we again moved up to many of our mesa tops that were fortified, where we could see, and we just about 2 miles from where I'm sitting today is our community of Horn Mesa. And it's up top of Mesa, and when you're up there, you can see forever, all the way down the Rio Grande Valley. You can see to the mesa tops in Jemez, which is across the East Jemez mountain region. You can see up north to near the pueblos of San Ildefonso and Santa Clara. There's some mesa tops there. So why I mentioned that, this as a milestone, is it was really a line in the sand for the Pueblo people, saying, we want to hold on to our traditions. We want to hold on to the way that we see the world. We want to hold on and continue to carry that going forward, not for necessarily for those people that were living during the Pueblo Revolt, but for those future generations, for me, for those living today, and for my kids, and hopefully future grandkids along the way. And so in that, our leaderships drew that line, and why I'm going to refer to this later on, is really a strength in our Pueblo perspective, which then I will talk about in the future as we look to how we manage water today and what our future looks like as well. So as I said, the Spanish were here, and then this area became part of Mexico. And so under the Mexico government, the Mexican government also saw Pueblos very different than some of our nomadic tribes in the Southwest. Those nomadic tribes being Navajo, Apaches, some of the Ute tribes up in the Four Corners area and up in Colorado. Those tribes were more nomadic, where Pueblos are very stationary, sedentary. Again, we had a village, we had agriculture, we had infrastructure, we had governance. So under the Mexican rule, as well as recognition that at one point the Pueblo people moved the Spanish people out of these areas along the Middle Rio Grande, was a recognition of the strength of our sovereignty, the strength of our governance, and the strength of our culture and traditions. And that is deeply embedded and tied to the land that we sit on today for many of our Pueblos. And where Pueblos are unique from some of the other 500 plus tribes across the country, where many of us are actually in the location that we were since time immemorial and before the Spanish came to the area, where other tribes were displaced or moved or put on reservations that in areas that they may not have been traveling in or lived in previously. So that's a unique aspect, and it goes back to the water and land. So then we go fast forward in 1848, there was the ending of the Mexican-American War, and then the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And underneath that treaty, which is a treaty between Mexico and the United States, Pueblos became part of the United States. And so that was a real landmark milestone in our paper history, our land and water right history in particular. And under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Pueblo people were, umbrella differently than, say, the Navajos or the Apaches here in New Mexico. So under that Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was the acknowledgement of our land and water rights, and which is going to be really important as we come forward when New Mexico becomes a state after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and after this area became part of the United States. And then in that time frame, in the late 1880s and early 1900s, there was a whole slew of acts and a lot of legislation that came through, as well as the establishment of the state New Mexico as a state. And one of the key, in particular to water, is the establishment of the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy area and district. And that happened in the 1920s. And that was actually when an initial dam was built just about a mile from where I'm at, here at Cochiti, Pueblo. And that then started that Middle Rio Grande irrigation district from Cochiti, Pueblo, all the way down into Santo Domingo, Pueblo, some of the land grant areas between the two Pueblos, then San Felipe just south of Santo Domingo. But this act also incorporated these Pueblos, and we call them the 6 Middle Rio Grande, and those are Cochiti, Santo Domingo, San Felipe, Santa Ana, Sandia, and Isleta Pueblo. And today we still sit here along the Middle Rio Grande, those 6 Pueblos. And so we were incorporated into that Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District area. And underneath that act, the 1928 Act, it acknowledged the prior and paramount water rights held by the Middle Rio Grande Pueblos. and recognize rights for also newly reclaimed lands. So those were our lands that maybe in that time frame were we couldn't irrigate to because we didn't have infrastructure to irrigate, but they sit along this floodplain along the river. So there are now today some areas where we have where infrastructure couldn't reach and we couldn't irrigate those areas. But I will say in many of those areas, we did have historical farms for corn and native crops that we still now are able to irrigate off the river because of the infrastructure that was developed after the establishment of the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District. So as we go forward, I mentioned something just now that I probably need to highlight a little bit more. Here along the Middle Rio Grande, the northern Middle Rio Grande pueblos that I'm familiar with, more familiar than say from Santa Ana, Sandia, and Isleta, but up here in the northern part of the Middle Rio Grande, many of these pueblos, we still have our traditional governance, meaning we're not a constitutional pueblo or pueblos in terms of our governance. They maintain a strong traditional sense of sovereignty, following annual appointment systems where the leadership changes every year. And then we also, in this, I would say the northern portion of the Middle Rio Grande, many of our lands still contain traditional crops of corn, tobacco, native tobacco, other gourds, and squash, beans, and other traditional crops. And being from a couple of these pueblos, I will say that that is an essential part of who we are. As I said, we are an agricultural people. Our traditions, our way of life is based upon the ability to grow these crops, as well as the continuance of our way of life in a traditional and I feel awkward saying this, but religious way. Religion doesn't really fully encompass and describe that, but in the Western world, that's what they would call it, our religion. We need these crops that come from these fields that are irrigated off the Rio Grande in order to maintain our way of life, in order to do what we need to do on a daily basis. I will say every day I use a product from our family field in order to maintain our traditional way of life multiple times throughout the day. And so our ability along the Middle Rio Grande and to continue to irrigate is not just from a commercial standpoint and an economical standpoint, but it is deeply we are deeply dependent upon the ability to irrigate in order to grow those crops that are essential for our way of life. So I just wanted to highlight that as I continue to talk here. And so when our pueblos talk about, and I want to say too, the Middle Rio Grande, the 6 pueblos are not adjudicated. We have yet to adjudicate our water rights. Many of the pueblos here in New Mexico have either adjudicated their water rights or are in the process of adjudicating their water rights. So my understanding is that on the table, we have the Pueblo of Acoma, Laguna, the Pueblo of Laguna, the Pueblo of Jemez, the Pueblo of Zia, and the Okeawinge, that are all in the process of have proposed settlements with the state of New Mexico and for their adjudication of their water rights. And again, the 6 Middle Rio Grande still has yet to be adjudicated. Another 4 pueblos have been adjudicated or settled, I should say, had water settlements through the Ament settlement, which is along the Powaki and Nambe River in northern New Mexico. And those pueblos are Tesuque, Nambe, Powaki, and San Ildefonso. Taos was one of the first pueblos that they're the most northern pueblo to adjudicate their water rights decades ago. And so again, there's still a handful of pueblos that have yet to even initiate that adjudication process. And so I just wanted to mention, and each one, I want to say this too, is the pueblos are on a spectrum. We have some pueblos that are constitutional pueblos, meaning that they have a voting system, they have a constitution, and are follow that particular path. And like I said, there are still many pueblos that follow a traditional appointment system. And why I say that is because then the decision making, as well as some of the, like I said, here in the northern Middle Rio Grande pueblos, some of their traditions may be more tied to those traditional forms of governance as well. And I just want to bring up an example too, as we continue to talk about water rights and water management along the Rio Grande River. We have a number of instances where, although, as I explained, the prior and paramount water rights were documented in the early 1900s for the Pueblo people. It's called prior and paramount. I want to just note a fact that when those initial agreements, whether we're talking or acts, talking about the Rio Grande Compact agreement, talking about the acts and some of the establishment of even the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, the Pueblo leadership was not at the table. And so as we continue to, and maybe our Pueblo leadership at the time didn't know what they didn't know, and didn't know that, you know, that maybe they should have a seat at the table to try to make sure that the sustainability and the adherence to that agreement of prior and paramount water rights was always voiced at the table. Unfortunately, that didn't happen over 100 years ago. And so as we continue to learn more, as I said, my grandpa always suggested to me to continue to learn. I think it's really important that our tribal leadership, our Pueblo leadership, continues to learn and navigate these agreements and compacts and legal mechanisms that were described earlier, and trying to figure out how their prior and paramount water rights are upheld, but with the knowledge and the understanding that it is very complex. But in order for us to continue to live our way of life, we need to have not only the irrigable lands to be irrigated in order to grow native crops, but the natural flow of the river itself is essential to our way of life. And I'll tell a quick story on that. So my grandma from San Felipe, she was a traditional leader in her own right. And one time in the 1990s, I was a high school kid, and we were sitting there talking, and our family house is a stone's throw away from the Rio Grande River there in the heart of San Felipe Pueblo. And we were just talking about the river, and I was telling her, and as many of the folks today were describing, our elected leaders in the federal and state leaderships are very important, and very important to make sure that we elect leaders that are able to listen, able to I guess make good decisions on behalf of their constituents. And so I was telling her that I was like, Grandma, it's really important that we start to vote. And she was very traditionalist. She's like, well, I don't understand how to vote. And I said, well, we need folks, and I pointed to the river, that in the Western world and in the federal government and in our state government, to really understand and make sure that the river is taken care of, that it can be there for future generations. And she looked at me, she's like, oh, the river's always going to be there. And so as I've grown up and in my career, understanding that, of course, that we've hit some drought years here in the Southwest, and water becomes a resource that maybe is becoming scarcer in various forms along the hydrological cycle, and clean water at that. In her mind in the 1990s, it was not even a thought for her that our river along, a stone's throw from her house would be in jeopardy of not flowing. And as I said, the river itself is very important to our way of life as well. Not just the amount of flow, but I also want to speak a little bit about the water quality of the river. And the water quality is important because we actually utilize the river without treatment. There's times when we drink from it. There's times we bathe in it. There's times we gather, in a bucket and cook with it. So in order for the river to be healthy and have good water quality, that also is dependent upon the river being able to flow and have a healthy ecosystem. And that's one thing that I found is here in New Mexico, there's a very siloed approach to managing our water. In one area, we have our, Water Quality Control Commission at the state, and then another area, we have our state engineer's office. And sometimes the two don't necessarily overlap to consider how we take care of and how we steward our water resources. And so these perspectives that I bring, because we actively use water from the source, it is so important that we make sure that we also, as we talk about quantity, talk about water quality. And in many of our existing legal frameworks, that discussion and interrelationship is not mentioned. And I think just from hearing the elders speak and former leadership, that is probably one of the things that may have been missing over the last 100 years in the discussion of prior and paramount water rights, and in discussion of these legal frameworks that manage and kind of help the state and the feds and other entities make decisions regarding our rivers through New Mexico, as in particular the Rio Grande. And why I want to bring that up is because here at Cochiti, we had another example, and this is what's been on the screen here, is the establishment of the Cochiti Dam. It was as a result of a flood control act that was passed by Congress, because the Middle Rio Grande used to flood. And from an ecological standpoint, that's what helped the Middle Rio Grande also cleanse itself. There's certain ecological requirements and features along the Middle Rio Grande that we don't see today because we don't have that flooding of the Middle Rio Grande River as we did prior to the building of the Cochiti Lake and the dam associated with the lake. And why for me, when I began learning about water, not only from a traditional standpoint, but from a formal education standpoint, the building of the Cochiti Dam was another data point, if you will, of the need to really engage our Pueblo perspective and our Pueblo and ensure that our tribal leaders and Pueblo leaderships have a seat at the table, and that it really be incorporated. The federal government uses the term traditional ecological knowledge, TEK. That is now the term that is used in many of our federal documents going as they get amended or updated, and there's an evolution of those federal documents. So with TEK, with traditional ecological knowledge, our elders said, and our traditional leadership did not want to build that dam. They couldn't voice it in Western science language or in legal language. They could only voice it within the oral tradition of Keres and the understanding of the unique features of this particular area here at Cochiti, and how the river flowed, and how the ecology worked, and how the hydrological systems worked. And I always like to say this, my grandmas and grandfathers way back when, we were the first hydrologists. We were the first geologists. We were the first ecologists. We were the first botanists. We were the first meteorologists in this landscape that we call New Mexico and along the middle Rio Grande. And so in that knowledge is an understanding of the balance of that cycle. And so with this building of the Cochiti Dam, we see another instance where that expertise and knowledge was not integrated in how that was constructed, where it was constructed, and whether it was good for this area. And because of that, we had a particular area that was heavily damaged and destroyed. And it was not just something that the Cochiti Pueblo that was unique to Cochiti, it was actually unique to many tribes and other Pueblos here in the Southwest. And that's where then we become a fierce advocate for making sure that these traditional ecological concepts of traditional ecological knowledge do have a seat at the table as we continue to talk about the Middle Rio Grande. And so I know I'm running close on time. Please put it in the chat for me if we can give me a time check. But I would like to continue to speak a little bit more about, as we move forward in the current constructs that we have from a legal standpoint, from the state, from the feds, and then the ongoing various assessments, settlements, and adjudications here along the Rio Grande, that again, even as we try to navigate, and I like the words of some of the former panelists that were on before me, that we continue have to work together. We have to work together on how we navigate the stewardship and the taking care of the Rio Grande River. I always, like I shared earlier, I always remember what my grandma said, in that the river is essential to our people, our way of life. And if it were to no longer flow, and we were no longer able to utilize the river because of water quality concerns, that would be almost like a canary in the coal mine. And one of those red flags of, we really need to make sure that we do what we need to do from an individual to a community perspective, to a state perspective, to a country perspective, of how we take care of the river. And remember, it's only one part of the hydrological cycle. The hydrological cycle, as now we've seen by the scientists drawing, it goes, we have a large hydrological cycle from our oceans into the lands and the country, but we have our local hydrological cycles that where it is tied to the mist, to the clouds, to the rain, to the snow, to the ground, to how the ground absorbs it, to how then it flows in streams, then to the rivers, how the rivers and streams give back and breathe. They breathe water. They breathe water underground to above ground, underground, depending on times of day, depending on times of year. And now science has affirmed that through many studies along our rivers and streams, and in particular, the Rio Grande. So I just want to, as we talk about the quantification of water rights and how we manage it, I just want to bring that perspective of the whole cycle, and that it is complicated. It is something that, as I think I heard earlier, to simplify it is unfortunately not doing our analysis and our decision making justice. I wish it could be simple. Often people come to me and say, well, let's just, can you make it easy, Phoebe? Can you simplify it so that, you know, we can understand over here, to make good decisions? And unfortunately, it is not simple. And so for those in the room and those others that have gone on the panel before me, as we continue our Rio Grande and the state of the Rio Grande, just to keep those concepts in mind as we work together, as we talk together, as we learn together of how to take care of our precious river that feeds all our communities from Colorado all the way down to the ocean. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for the time and appreciate you all.
Phoebe, thank you for your presentation. And for joining us this weekend.